Somewhere on a quiet stretch of ocean tonight, a ferry sails past the exact waters where thousands vanished in a single hour. In London, commuters walk past a station wall that once turned into a wall of fire. And on trading floors from Hong Kong to New York, the same numbers on the same screens still echo a single Monday that erased $500 billion before the lunch. 1987 didn't warn anyone, it just happened again and again. Ferries capsized, earthquakes swallowed a nation's only pipeline, floodwater erased entire towns in South Africa. A single Monday in October when nearly $2 trillion of global wealth vanished before the closing bell. A fire in the heart of London that turned a subway station into an inferno. And finally, in the final days before Christmas, the deadliest peacetime disaster at sea in recorded history. 6 catastrophes, 9 months, thousands of lives lost in ways that in almost every case should never have happened at all. 1987 was supposed to be an ordinary year. Ronald Reagan sat in the White House. Margaret Thatcher had just won a third term in Britain. The Cold War simmered quietly in the background, while ordinary families boarded ferries, rode subways, and watched their retirement savings grow in a stock market that seemed unstoppable. Nobody boarding the Herald of Free Enterprise on a cold March evening in Belgium thought twice about it. Nobody walking through King's Cross Station on a Wednesday night in November gave the wooden escalators a second glance. Disaster in 1987 did not announce itself. It waited in the ordinary places, the ferry terminal, the subway platform, the trading floor, and it struck without warning, over and over, until the year became one of the deadliest stretches of the entire decade. By the time the year ended, the world would witness catastrophe on nearly every continent. A ferry capsizing in minutes off the coast of Belgium, an earthquake in the Amazon rainforest severing a nation's economic lifeline overnight, floodwaters swallowing entire towns in South Africa, a single Monday in October when nearly $2 trillion of global wealth vanished before the closing bell. A fire in the heart of London that turned a subway station into an inferno. And finally, in the final days before Christmas, the deadliest peacetime disaster at sea in recorded history. 6 catastrophes, 9 months, thousands of lives lost in ways that in almost every case should never have happened at all.
To understand how one year could hold so much loss, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a cold Friday evening in March, when a routine ferry crossing across the English Channel became one of the worst maritime disasters Britain had ever seen. It started, as so many disasters do, with something small. A door left open, a man asleep at his post. Nobody paid attention until it was already too late. At 6:05 p.m. on March 6, 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise pulled away from the harbor wall at Zeebrugge, Belgium, bound for Dover with 459 passengers and 80 crew aboard. It was a routine crossing the ferry had made hundreds of times before. Nobody on the bridge could see the bow doors from where they stood, a design flaw nobody had thought to fix. And nobody had checked whether those doors were closed. The assistant boatswain responsible for shutting them was asleep in his bunk, exhausted from an overloaded work schedule. Within minutes of leaving port, the ferry picked up speed and water began pouring through the open bow doors into the car deck. In less than 90 seconds, the Herald of Free Enterprise rolled onto its side in shallow water just outside the harbor. Furniture, vehicles, and passengers were thrown across the ship as it capsized almost without warning. Freezing water flooded the lower decks in complete darkness, trapping families who had been eating dinner moments before. A total of 193 people lost their lives that night, most from hypothermia in the icy Channel water. It remains, to this day, the deadliest disaster involving a British-registered ship since 1919.
The official inquiry that followed uncovered something far more disturbing than a single sleeping crewman. Investigators found that the ship's owners had known for years that bow door indicator lights were missing from the bridge, that schedules were pushing crews past safe limits, and that warnings from ship's captains had been repeatedly ignored by head office. Lord Justice Barry Sheen, who led the inquiry, delivered a verdict that would echo through boardrooms for decades. The company, he said, was infected from top to bottom with a disease of sloppiness. It was the first time in British legal history that a corporation was charged with manslaughter. Just one day before the Herald of Free Enterprise capsized, a very different disaster was unfolding in Ecuador. On the night of March 5, 1987, two massive earthquakes tore through the eastern slopes of the Andes near the Reventador volcano, registering magnitudes of 6.8 and 7.1. The tremors triggered enormous landslides across the rain-soaked mountainsides, sending millions of cubic meters of rock, mud, and jungle crashing into the valleys below. The landslides destroyed nearly 40 kilometers of the Trans-Ecuadorian oil pipeline, the single artery responsible for 60% of the country's export revenue. An estimated 1,000 people died, with tens of thousands more displaced across the isolated Amazon provinces. It would take until August, 5 long months of national financial strain, before oil began to flow through a rebuilt pipeline again. In a single night, a natural disaster had become an economic one. By late September, attention had shifted to the southeastern coast of South Africa, where a slow-moving weather system parked itself over the province of Natal. For 5 consecutive days beginning September 25th, the skies simply refused to stop. Some areas recorded up to 900 millimeters of rainfall, more than many regions see in an entire year, falling in less than a week. The Umgeni River rose so violently that it washed an entire island off the map. The Mvoti River, normally just 35 meters wide, swelled to nearly a kilometer across. More than 30,000 homes were destroyed, leaving over 50,000 people without shelter. 14 bridges were washed away entirely, and 4 major aqueducts serving the city of Durban were destroyed, cutting off clean water to hundreds of thousands of residents. By the time the water receded, 506 people were confirmed dead, the deadliest natural disaster in South African history. For the families of KwaZulu-Natal, the flood did not just take homes, it took the fragile infrastructure an already struggling region depended on to survive. Entire communities would spend years rebuilding roads, water systems, and schools that vanished in less than 120 hours of relentless rain. On the morning of October 19, 1987, traders walked onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange expecting a rough day. Nobody expected what actually happened. The selling had already started in Hong Kong hours earlier, spreading through Europe like a wave nobody could stop. By the time the opening bell rang on Wall Street, the panic had circled the entire globe. By the closing bell, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had fallen 508 points, a drop of 22.6% in a single trading session, the largest one-day percentage decline in the history of the stock market. More than $500 billion in value vanished from the New York Stock Exchange alone. Around the world, an estimated $1.7 trillion in wealth disappeared in a matter of hours. In Australia and New Zealand, markets fell so far that the day became known simply as Black Tuesday. Investigators later pointed to a dangerous new force behind the collapse: computer-driven trading programs designed to sell automatically once prices dropped, creating a feedback loop that accelerated the crash far beyond anything human traders could control. It was, in many ways, the first disaster of the algorithmic age. And yet, in one of the strangest twists of 1987, the market clawed back nearly 60% of its losses within just 2 trading sessions, and by December, the Dow had actually ended the year higher than where it started. At around 7:25 p.m. on November 18, 1987, a commuter dropped a lit match onto a wooden escalator at King's Cross St. Pancras Station, one of the busiest interchanges on the London Underground. It should have been nothing, just another small fire that burned out on its own, the way dozens of similar incidents had before it. This time, it wasn't. The fire smoldered beneath the escalator for nearly 20 minutes, growing hotter along the grease-caked wooden structure. Then, in a phenomenon investigators would later call the trench effect, flames raced up the incline and erupted into the ticket hall in a single, devastating flashover. Passengers who had been calmly waiting for trains just moments earlier were suddenly engulfed in a wall of fire and black smoke. 31 people died that night, including fire station officer Colin Townsley, who had rushed in to help just before the flashover struck. The inquiry that followed, led by Desmond Fennell, delivered a chilling conclusion. This disaster had been entirely foreseeable. London Underground management had received internal warnings about wooden escalators and fire risk for years and had done nothing. It was, investigators said, a culture that had never actually caused a death before, so nobody believed it ever would. Governments moved fast, at least on paper. Britain's Department of Transport introduced sweeping new maritime safety regulations following the Zeebrugge inquiry, eventually requiring bow door indicator lights on every roll-on, roll-off ferry in the country. London Underground replaced every wooden escalator in its network with fire-resistant steel, a project that took years and cost hundreds of millions of pounds. Stock exchanges around the world introduced circuit breakers designed to automatically halt trading during extreme volatility, a direct response to the chaos of Black Monday.
The economic aftershocks lasted much longer than the headlines suggested. Ecuador lost hundreds of millions of dollars in export revenue, while its pipelines sat broken for months. South Africa spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars rebuilding roads, bridges, and water systems in Natal. And while Wall Street recovered its losses within 2 years, thousands of financial workers lost their jobs in the layoffs that followed Black Monday, and the number of companies willing to go public dropped sharply for years afterward. But no policy change could undo what families had already lost. Survivors of the Herald of Free Enterprise carried permanent psychological scars, and many never boarded a ferry again. Families of the King's Cross victims spent years fighting for London Underground to be held accountable. In Ecuador and South Africa, entire generations grew up in communities still rebuilding roads and homes a decade later. The human cost of 1987 could never be fully measured in regulations or dollar figures. On the night of December 20th, 1987, the passenger ferry Doña Paz departed Tacloban in the Philippines, bound for Manila, packed with families traveling home for Christmas. The ship's official manifest listed just under 1,500 passengers. The real number on board that night, historians now believe, was closer to 4,000, nearly 3 times its legal capacity, filled with unregistered ticket sales that had become common practice during the holiday season. At around 10:30 that night in the Tablas Strait near Marinduque, the Doña Paz collided head-on with the oil tanker MT Vector, which was carrying nearly 9,000 barrels of gasoline and petroleum products. The impact ignited the tanker's cargo instantly, turning the surrounding sea into a sheet of flame. Passengers who survived the initial collision had no time to reach lifeboats. Many jumped directly into water that was already on fire. The Doña Paz sank within 2 hours. The Vector went down 4 hours later. It took Philippine maritime authorities 8 hours to even learn that the collision had happened, and another 8 hours before search and rescue operations began. By the time it was over, only 26 people had survived out of what may have been more than 4,300 people on board. It remains, to this day, the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster ever recorded, deadlier than the Titanic more than 3 times over. The tragedy exposed a maritime safety crisis across the Philippines that regulations still struggle to fully solve today. Just 1 year later, another ship owned by the same company, the Doña Marilyn, sank in a typhoon, killing 150 more people. The Doña Paz disaster is now taught in maritime academies around the world as the ultimate case study in what happens when profit, corruption, and complacency collide at sea. Look closely at every disaster in 1987, and a pattern emerges that is almost too uncomfortable to admit. The Herald of Free Enterprise sank because a warning light was never installed. King's Cross burned because years of internal memos were ignored. The Doña Paz sank because corruption allowed a ship built for 1,500 people to carry nearly 3 times that number. Almost none of these disasters were acts of God, they were acts of neglect. And yet, out of nearly every one of these tragedies came real change. Ferries got safer, fire codes got stricter, financial markets got smarter about their own fragility. The lessons of 1987, paid for in thousands of lives, quietly reshaped the rules that protect us today every time we board a ship, ride a train, or watch a market ticker scroll by. 1987 began like any other year and ended as one of the deadliest ever recorded outside of war. But if there's one thing this year proved, it's that catastrophe rarely comes from nowhere. It comes from small, quiet decisions. A door left unchecked, a memo left unread, a ticket sold that should never have been sold. The ships have changed, the stations have changed, the markets have changed, but the lesson of 1987 has never stopped being true. It is always the smallest neglected detail that writes history's darkest chapters.